The morning sun cast long shadows across the mining colony of Kepler 442b as Taemin stepped off the transport shuttle. His boots crunched against the crystalline sand that covered everything on this strange world. The air tasted metallic and sharp in his lungs. He had traveled 3 months through space to reach this distant planet, carrying nothing but his research equipment and a head full of questions about the creatures he was sent to study. Taemin was a xenobiologist, which meant he studied alien life forms. Most people thought his job was boring. They were wrong. Today would prove just how wrong they were. The first thing that struck him about the mining operation was the sound, or rather the lack of it. Despite massive excavation work happening all around him, the colony was eerily quiet. No shouting workers, no rumbling machinery, no industrial noise. Just a soft scraping sound that seemed to come from everywhere, at once. Then he saw them. The alien dragons moved through the mining pits like living mountains. Each creature stood 15 feet tall, their bodies covered in scales that looked like pieces of broken rainbow. The scales shifted color as they moved, sometimes blue like deep ocean water, sometimes green like ancient forests, sometimes clear as glass. Their necks were long and graceful, ending in heads that seemed too intelligent for mere beasts. But they moved wrong. Taemin watched as the nearest dragon lifted a boulder the size of a small building. Its massive claws closed around the rock with perfect precision. No wasted motion, no hesitation. It carried the boulder to a processing station, set it down exactly where it belonged, then turned and walked back for another. Every step was identical to the last. Every movement was perfectly efficient. It was like watching a machine made of flesh and scales. Director Sora appeared beside him, her black hair pulled back in a tight knot that matched her expression. She had been running this mining operation for 7 years, and it showed in the way she carried herself. Every gesture was sharp and purposeful. "Beautiful, aren't they?" she said, though her voice held no warmth. The Galactic Mining Consortium spent 50 years perfecting the conditioning process. These dragons can work 20-hour shifts without rest. They never complain, never make mistakes, never ask for more food or better living conditions. Taemin watched another dragon as it sorted through a pile of ore. Its claws, each one as long as his arm, picked through the rocks with impossible delicacy. It could tell the difference between valuable crystals and worthless stone just by touch. But its eyes looked empty, dead. "How long have they been working here?" Taemin asked. "Some of them have been here for over 200 years, Sora replied with pride. "That one there, we call it Unit 7. It was one of the first dragons processed by the early conditioning techniques. Still works as well as the day it arrived. Unit 7. Taemin felt something cold settle in his stomach. The dragon she pointed to was larger than the others, with scales that held more silver than the younger ones. Ancient scars crossed its hide like a roadmap of centuries, but it moved with the same mechanical precision as all the rest. "They have names," Taemin said quietly. Sora looked at him sharply. "Excuse me. The dragons, they have names. Real names. From before the conditioning. Dr. Taemin, I think you misunderstand your assignment here." Sora's voice became cold as the space between stars. "You are here to study their efficiency ratings and physical capabilities. Nothing more. These creatures are valuable assets of the consortium. They are not pets, and they certainly are not people." But Taemin was no longer listening to her. He was watching Unit 7, the ancient dragon with silver scales. For just a moment, just a fraction of a second, the dragon had paused. Its head had turned slightly toward where they stood talking, almost like it was listening. That evening, Taemin set up his equipment in the small laboratory the colony had provided. The room was basic but functional, with enough space for his computers and scanning devices. Through the window, he could see the dragons still working under the artificial lights that turned night into day on this world. He pulled up the files the consortium had given him. Each dragon was listed by number and basic physical measurements: weight, height, scale density, claw sharpness, like specifications for mining equipment. There was no mention of their original names, their homeworld, or what they had been like before the conditioning. But Taman was a scientist, and scientists asked questions. He spent the next 3 days observing the dragons during their work cycles. He timed their movements, recorded their efficiency rates, and filled out the reports the consortium expected. But he also did something else. He watched their eyes. The dragons never looked at each other directly. They never paused to rest unless specifically programmed to do so. They never showed curiosity about anything beyond their assigned tasks. But sometimes, in moments so brief he almost missed them, Taman saw something flicker behind those ancient eyes. A spark that the conditioning had failed to completely extinguish. On the 4th day, Taman met Hanul. Hanul was a maintenance engineer who had worked on Kepler 442b for 3 years. She was small and quick, with calloused hands and oil stains on her work clothes. Unlike the other humans on the colony, she spent most of her time among the dragons, repairing their equipment and checking their health. "You're the new researcher," she said, finding Taman in the dragon work area. "I heard you've been asking strange questions." "What kind of questions would those be?" Taman replied carefully. Hanul studied his face for a long moment. Then she glanced around to make sure they were alone. "Questions about whether they dream. Questions about their names. Questions about what they were like before." Taman felt his heart speed up. "And what do you think about those questions?" "I think," Hanul said slowly, "that Unit 7's real name is Kaelva. I think Unit 3 used to be called Velthara. And I think the conditioning doesn't work as well as the consortium believes it does." She led him to a quiet corner where the dragons recharged during their brief rest periods. The creatures stood motionless, their eyes closed, looking like statues, carved from living crystal. But Hanul pointed to small details Taman had missed. The way Kaelva's claws sometimes twitched during rest cycles. How Velthara's scales changed color in patterns that had nothing to do with temperature or light. "They're still in there," Hanul whispered. "Buried deep, but still there. The question is, what are we going to do about it?" That night, Taman could not sleep. He stood at his window watching the dragons work under the artificial suns. Somewhere inside those conditioned minds, entire personalities were trapped. Memories, emotions, hopes, and dreams all locked away by surgical precision. And tomorrow, he would have to decide whether he was just another researcher collecting data for the consortium or something more dangerous. A man who believed that consciousness deserved freedom no matter what form it took. Taman began his secret research 3 days after his conversation with Hanul. Every morning, he completed his official reports for the consortium. Every afternoon, he conducted his real work. His portable scanner was small enough to hide in his jacket pocket. During the dragon's rest periods, he would position himself near Kaelva and run quiet neural scans. The first few attempts showed exactly what the consortium files claimed. Flat brain activity, no emotional responses, perfect conditioning. But on the 7th day, something changed. The scanner picked up a tiny spike of neural activity deep in Kaelva's brain. It lasted only 2 seconds, but it was there. Activity in the emotional processing center that should have been completely dead. Taman ran the scan 3 more times to be sure. Each time, the results were the same. Something was waking up inside the dragon's mind. Hanul found him that evening in the maintenance bay staring at his scanner readings. She looked over his shoulder at the data streaming across the small screen. "Neural regeneration," she said quietly. "I've been wondering when someone would finally detect it." Taman turned to face her. "You knew about this." "I suspected. I've worked with these dragons for 3 years. You start to notice patterns." Hanul pulled up a chair and sat down beside him. "Kaelva pauses sometimes, just for a fraction of a second, when it thinks no one is watching." "Pauses how?" "Yesterday, it was sorting ore like always. But when it picked up a piece of blue crystal, it held it for maybe half a second longer than necessary, like it was looking at it. Really looking, not just processing." Taman felt excitement and fear war in his chest. If the consortium finds out about this, They'll recondition it. Full, neural wipe this time. Make sure nothing can grow back. Hanul's voice was grim. But there's something else you should know. It's not just Kaelva. She led him to the dragon rest area. 12 massive creatures stood in perfect rows, their eyes closed, their breathing slow and regular. To most observers, they looked identical in their stillness. But Hanul pointed out details that revealed the truth. Velthera's scales shifted through subtle color patterns during rest cycles. The patterns were too complex to be random biological functions. They looked almost like language. Morden, a younger dragon, sometimes moved its claws in tiny gestures. The movements were so small they were almost invisible, but they followed consistent patterns, like it was practicing something it remembered from long ago. The conditioning is breaking down, Hanul explained. Maybe it was never as permanent as they thought. Maybe consciousness is stronger than surgical scars. Over the next week, Taemin documented 17 instances of irregular behavior among the dragons. Microscopic pauses in their work routines. Tiny variations in their movement patterns. Moments where their eyes seemed to focus on something beyond their immediate tasks. But it was Kaelva who showed the most dramatic changes. The ancient dragon began to deviate from its programmed efficiency. Instead of taking the shortest path between ore deposits and processing stations, it sometimes took routes that led past the colony's small garden area. It would pause there, just for a moment, its great head turning toward the earth plants that somehow grew in this alien soil. Taemin was documenting one of these incidents when the accident happened. The mining operation had been working a new crystal vein deep in the planet's crust. The excavation required precise coordination between human workers and dragon laborers. Everything went smoothly until a support beam, weakened by years of vibration, finally gave way. The tunnel collapse was sudden and complete. Tons of rock and crystal crashed down, sealing 6 human workers inside a pocket of space barely large, enough to hold them. Emergency teams rushed to the scene, but the debris was too heavy and unstable for human equipment to move safely. Standard protocol required the dragons to wait for specific commands from human supervisors. The rescue plan would take hours to develop and approve. The trapped workers had minutes. Kaelva was stationed 50 meters from the collapse site when it happened. According to its conditioning, it should have continued its assigned task until receiving new orders. Mining dragons were not programmed for independent rescue operations, but Kaelva did something that should have been impossible. It dropped the load of ore it was carrying and moved toward the collapse. Not quickly, not dramatically, but with quiet determination that had nothing to do with programming. Its massive claws began moving rocks with surgical precision, creating a stable excavation path toward the trapped workers. Other dragons in the area stopped their tasks and turned to watch. This had never happened before. Dragons did not observe each other. They did not show curiosity about activities outside their assigned duties. Director Sora arrived at the collapse site 17 minutes later, her face twisted with fury and confusion. She found Kaelva working steadily through the debris, ignoring her shouted orders to stop. Behind the ancient dragon, 3 other dragons had abandoned their posts and begun assisting with the rescue. "What is happening here?" Sora demanded, grabbing Taemin by the arm. "Why are they acting independently?" Taemin watched Kaelva gently move a boulder that would have crushed a human worker. The dragon's movements were still precise, but they were no longer mechanical. There was something else there now. Purpose. Choice. "I think," Taemin said carefully, "they're remembering what they used to be." The rescue took 43 minutes. All 6 trapped workers were pulled from the debris alive and largely uninjured. The dragons had worked with impossible delicacy, removing tons of rock without causing further collapse or harm to the humans inside. But their success created a bigger problem. The colony's AI monitoring system had recorded everything. Detailed files now existed, showing dragons acting outside their conditioning parameters, acting with independent judgment, acting like the sentient beings they had once been. Sora stood in the aftermath, surrounded by grateful human workers and 4 dragons who should not have been capable of the rescue they had just performed. Her career, her authority, everything she had built on this world depended on the dragons remaining perfectly conditioned tools. "Dr. Taemin," she said, her voice deadly quiet. "Report to my office immediately. And you," she pointed at Kelva, "will be taken for immediate reconditioning, full neural reset." As security personnel moved to surround the ancient dragon, Taemin saw something in Kelva's eyes that made his heart race. For just a moment, the emptiness was gone. In its place was an expression he recognized: fear. Not the simple fear of damage or malfunction, but the deep, complex fear of a thinking being who understood what was about to be taken away. Kelva was awake enough now to know that reconditioning meant death. The death of whatever consciousness had managed to claw its way back from surgical oblivion. The dragon looked directly at Taemin for the first time. In that gaze was a plea older than human civilization. "Help me." The reconditioning chamber stood at the center of the colony like a metal tomb. Taemin had never seen it used before, but he knew what happened inside. Neural suppressors would map every pathway in Kelva's brain. Then surgical lasers would burn away anything that looked like independent thought. The dragon would emerge as empty as it had been 2 centuries ago, maybe emptier. 6 security guards escorted Kelva through the colony's main corridor. The ancient dragon moved between them with mechanical obedience, but Taemin could see the difference now. The micropauses were still there. The tiny signs of awareness that marked a mind fighting against its chains. Other dragons throughout the colony had stopped working. They stood motionless at their stations, but their heads were turned toward the procession, watching. For the first time in centuries, they were choosing to observe something that had nothing to do with their assigned tasks. Director Sora walked beside the security team, her face set in hard lines. She had built her career on the perfect efficiency of conditioned dragons. The rescue operation had proven that her perfect system was cracking. Reconditioning Kelva was about more than maintaining one unit. It was about proving that the consortium still had control. Taemin followed at a distance, his mind racing through possibilities. Every plan he considered ended the same way. Security would stop him. Sora would have him arrested. Kelva would be reconditioned, and any evidence of dragon consciousness would disappear forever. But as they approached the reconditioning chamber, Taemin noticed something that changed everything. The other dragons were moving. Not obviously. Not in ways that would trigger security protocols. But throughout the colony, dragons were slowly shifting position, moving closer to the main corridor, converging on the reconditioning chamber without appearing to do so. Velthara had abandoned her ore sorting station and was walking toward them, carrying a load of crystals she didn't need to transport. Morden was approaching from another direction, ostensibly moving equipment. 12 other dragons were finding reasons to be near the chamber. They were gathering, like they understood what was happening, like they cared what happened to Kelva. The procession reached the chamber entrance. Director Sora keyed in her authorization codes while security guards positioned themselves around Kelva. The dragon stood perfectly still, but its scales were shifting through color patterns that had nothing to do with temperature or light. "Dr. Taemin," Sora called, without turning around. "Since you seem so interested in this unit's behavior, you can observe the reconditioning process. Consider it an educational opportunity." The chamber door slid open with a sound like breaking glass. Inside, surgical equipment gleamed under harsh white lights. Neural interface cables hung from the ceiling like metal snakes. This was where consciousness came to die. That was when Taemin made the decision that would change everything. Instead of following Sora into the chamber, he stepped directly in front of Kelva. The dragon was so massive that Taemin had to crane his neck back to see its face. Ancient eyes looked down at him, no longer empty, no longer dead. "I know," Taemin said quietly. "I know you're in there." He reached out and placed his bare hand against Kelva's scaled palm. The contact triggered something neither of them expected. Neural feedback exploded through Taemin's consciousness like lightning through water. Suddenly, he was experiencing Kelva's memories, emotions, and sensations as if they were his own, but not the mechanical present of conditioning and slavery. Instead, he was flooded with suppressed memories from before the surgery. He felt what it was like to soar through alien skies on wings that caught starlight. He experienced the deep contentment of family bonds, the joy of teaching young dragons to sing the crystal songs that shaped their world. He felt the terrible day when the ships came, when his people were taken, when everything beautiful was stripped away and replaced with empty servitude. But underneath it all was something even more powerful: loneliness. Not just the loneliness of imprisonment, but the deeper ache of a social being cut off from all connection. Centuries of isolation so complete that death would have been mercy. It was a pain Taemin recognized. His own childhood had been marked by loss. Parents killed in the colony wars, friends who died in mining accidents on a dozen different worlds. The slow retreat into emotional numbness that kept him functional, but cut him off from real human connection. He had learned to survive by feeling less, by building walls around his heart. "I know that pain," he whispered. The words somehow penetrated the barriers in Kael'va's mind. For the first time in 2 centuries, the dragon truly felt the touch of another being. Not just physical contact, but emotional recognition, understanding, empathy. Neural pathways that had been dormant for generations suddenly blazed with activity. Emotions flooded back in a rush that was both agony and ecstasy. Kael'va's scales erupted in patterns of color more complex and beautiful than any sunset. Its massive frame shuddered as consciousness fully awakened, but the awakening didn't stop with Kael'va. The dragons throughout the colony were connected by quantum-entangled neural networks originally designed to coordinate their work. As Kael'va's suppressed emotions came roaring back to life, the awakening cascaded through the connection to every other dragon on the planet. Velthara's eyes snapped open, truly open, for the first time in a century. She looked at her claws, at the ore she was carrying, at the world around her, and remembered what wonder felt like. Morden felt joy surge through his consciousness as he recalled the crystal songs of his youth. His voice, unused for so long, began to hum a melody that had been silenced for centuries. Throughout the colony, 16 dragons experienced their first emotions in lifetimes. Some felt overwhelming grief for their lost years. Others experienced pure joy at simply being able to feel again. All of them knew, with sudden, terrible clarity, what had been taken from them. Security guards raised their weapons. But they were facing something they had never trained for. Not rebellion or violence, but awakening consciousness. The dragons weren't attacking anyone. They were simply remembering how to be alive. Director Sora screamed orders that no one seemed to hear. Emergency alarms blared throughout the colony. But Taemin was still holding Kael'va's hand, still feeling the rush of a mind discovering itself after centuries of emptiness. "What have you done?" Sora grabbed Taemin's shoulder, trying to pull him away from the dragon. Kael'va moved for the first time with full conscious intent. Its free hand came up not to strike, but to gently block Sora from touching Taemin. The gesture was protective, deliberate, and completely impossible according to everything the consortium believed about conditioned dragons. "I remember," Kael'va said. Its voice was like distant thunder, like crystal singing in harmony. Words in a language that had been forbidden for 200 years. But somehow Taemin understood their meaning. "I remember my name, I remember my family. I remember what we were before you broke us." The ancient dragon looked around at its awakening kin, then back at Taemin. In its eyes was gratitude deeper than oceans, and a question that would determine the fate of everyone on Kepler 442b. What happens now? The colony descended into beautiful chaos within minutes of Kael'va's awakening. 16 dragons experiencing consciousness for the first time in centuries did not know how to contain their emotions. Velthara stood in the middle of her ore sorting station, weeping tears that sparkled like liquid diamonds. Her cries echoed across the mining pits. Not sounds of pain, but of overwhelming relief. She was finally able to mourn the family she had lost, the life that had been stolen from her. Morden's voice rose in crystal song. the ancient melloys of their homeworld pouring from his throat in harmonies that made the very air shimmer. Other dragons joined him, their voices blending in music that had been silent for 200 years. The sound was so beautiful that several human workers stopped in their tracks, tears streaming down their faces. But not all the awakening dragons experienced joy. Jindal, one of the younger dragons who had been conditioned as a hatchling, collapsed under the weight of emotions he had no framework to understand. He had never known freedom, never experienced choice, never felt love or friendship or hope. The sudden flood of consciousness was like drowning in an ocean after living in a desert. Hanul found him curled in the corner of a maintenance bay, his massive frame shaking with confusion and terror. She approached slowly, her hands held out, in the universal gesture of peace. "It's okay," she said softly. "I know it's overwhelming. But you're safe now. You're free." Jindal looked at her with eyes that held the wonder of a newborn and the ancient sadness of his people. "Free," he repeated, attesting the word. "What does that mean?" Throughout the colony, similar scenes played out as humans encountered dragons who were no longer tools but individuals. Some humans, like Hanul and her maintenance team, embraced the change. They had worked alongside the dragons for years, and had always suspected there was more beneath the conditioning. But others reacted with fear and hostility. Security Chief Dong Su gathered his forces and tried to implement emergency protocols. "All dragons are to be restrained immediately," he ordered over the colony's communication system. "This is a containment situation. Repeat, this is a containment situation." His security teams moved through the colony with neural suppressors and restraint equipment. But they quickly discovered a problem. The awakened dragons were no longer following human commands, but they weren't violent either. They simply stood their ground protecting each other and the humans who showed them kindness. When security officers approached Velthara with restraint cables, she spoke for the first time in a century and a half. "No," she said, her voice like wind through mountain caves. "We will not be chained again." She didn't attack the officers. She didn't threaten them. She simply refused to cooperate. Other dragons gathered around her, forming a protective circle. Their message was clear without being hostile. The time of unquestioning obedience was over. Taemin found himself at the center of the crisis. Director Sora had declared him responsible for the awakening and demanded his immediate arrest. But Kaelva stood beside him, and several human workers had joined them. Hanul was there, along with Minho, a young miner who had befriended several dragons during his 2 years on the colony. "Dr. Taemin," Minho said, his voice tight with excitement and fear. "I think I can do what you did. The neural connection. I've been trying to communicate with Senara, and I think it's working." Senara was a middle-aged dragon who had been conditioned 60 years ago. She had watched Minho work in the mining tunnels and had often positioned herself nearby, as if drawn to his presence. Now she stood close to him, her scales shifting through colors that seemed to respond to his emotions. Minho placed his hand against Senara's palm, just as Taemin had done with Kaelva. The connection formed immediately, and Minho gasped as Senara's memories flooded through him. But unlike Taemin's experience, this connection went both ways. Senara could feel Minho's emotions, his thoughts, his genuine care for her well-being. "It's not just me," Taemin realized. "It's humans in general. We can form neural connections with them, we can communicate directly." This discovery changed everything. Humans weren't just another species exploiting the dragons. They were potential partners, bridges between the awakened dragon consciousness and the wider galaxy. But Director Sora wasn't interested in partnerships. She stood in the colony's command center, surrounded by screens showing the chaos outside. Emergency reports flooded in from every section. Work had stopped completely. The dragons were refusing orders. Some humans were actively helping them resist reconditioning attempts. Her career was destroyed. The Galactic Mining Consortium would hold her responsible for losing control of the most valuable mining operation in this sector, unless she could fix this quickly and decisively. Send an emergency signal to Consortium headquarters, she ordered, her communications officer. Priority Alpha. Request immediate military intervention. Tell them we have a full rebellion in progress. Ma'am. The officer hesitated. Military intervention against dragons would require a complete orbital bombardment of the colony, Sora finished coldly. I'm aware of the protocols. Do it. Outside the command center, the awakening continued to spread in unexpected ways. Dragons who had rediscovered their voices began sharing memories through their crystal songs. The music carried information, emotions and experiences across the colony's communication networks. HFY sang of the homeworld, of crystal cities that grew like living things, and dragons who flew between the stars without ships. Velthara added her voice, remembering the children she had raised before the conditioning, the family bonds that had given meaning to existence. The songs told a story that contradicted everything the Consortium had taught about dragon history. These weren't primitive creatures who had been uplifted by human technology. They were an ancient civilization with science and culture that spanned millennia. They had been explorers, artists, philosophers, and guardians of crystalline technology that could reshape matter itself. Taemin listened to the songs and began to understand the true scope of what had been lost. The Consortium hadn't just enslaved a species. They had destroyed a civilization. But as the hours passed, it became clear that the awakening had created a new problem. The dragons remembered their power, their technology, their ability to manipulate the crystal formations that honeycombed this world. Some of them, particularly the ones who had suffered the most, began to speak of revenge. They took everything from us, said Corven, an older dragon whose scales bore the scars of decades in the deepest mines. Our freedom, our families, our very selves. Why should we show mercy to those who showed us none? The crystal formations around the colony began to resonate with the dragon's emotions. Taemin could feel the vibrations through the soles of his feet. If the dragons chose to use their full power, they could reshape the entire mining operation in minutes. They could turn the colony into crystal dust and everyone in it. HFY stood at the center of the debate, the first to awaken and thus the unofficial leader of the newly conscious dragons. The decision of whether to seek revenge or show mercy would ultimately rest with the ancient being who had suffered the longest. As emergency signals flashed overhead, announcing the approach of Consortium military vessels, HFY looked at Taemin with eyes that held the weight of centuries. Your people gave me back my heart, the dragon said, but my heart remembers pain as well as joy. What should I do with this power we possess? What should I do with this anger that burns like stars? The question hung in the air like the notes of a crystal song, and Taemin realized that his answer might determine whether the next few hours brought liberation or destruction to everyone on Kepler 442b. The Consortium fleet arrived like a storm of metal and fire against the star-filled sky. 12 warships dropped out of hyperspace and took position above Kepler 442b. Their weapons were already charging, orbital cannons that could turn the entire mining colony into glass and ash within minutes. Director Sora stood in the command center, watching the fleet's arrival on her screens with grim satisfaction. Behind her, communication officers coordinated with the military commanders above. Fleet. Admiral Kyung-woo to colony base crackled through the speakers. We have your emergency signal. Prepare for immediate evacuation of essential personnel. We will commence bombardment in 30 minutes. Sora activated her microphone. Admiral, this is Director Sora. I need more time to secure critical data from the negative, Director. Our orders are clear. The dragons have compromised conditioning protocols. This represents a threat to every mining operation in the sector. We cannot allow the rebellion to spread. 30 minutes. Taemin felt cold spread through his chest as he heard the announcement echoing through the colony's speakers. The Consortium wasn't interested in recapturing the dragons. They were going to eliminate the problem completely. Around him, the awakened dragons listened to their death sentence with expressions that mixed ancient sadness with newly rediscovered anger. For 2 centuries, they had been enslaved, tortured, and treated as property. Now their reward for consciousness was annihilation. But Kailva stood motionless in the center of the group, its massive head tilted, as if listening to something only it could hear. The crystal formations throughout the colony were singing, vibrating at frequencies that resonated with dragon consciousness. Ancient technology was awakening in response to the first free dragon minds in centuries. "We could fight," Corvin said, his voice like grinding stone. "The crystal networks respond to us now. We could turn their weapons against them. We could crack this planet open and swallow their ships." Other dragons murmured agreement. Their scales shifted through angry reds and violent purples. The power they possessed was real and devastating. They could reshape matter at the molecular level, turn the planet's crystal core into a weapon that could destroy entire fleets. Velthara stepped forward, her ancient eyes reflecting centuries of accumulated pain. "They deserve what they gave us: slavery, suffering, the loss of everything they hold dear." The crystals around them pulsed brighter, responding to the dragon's collective anger. Taemin could feel the planet itself beginning to resonate with their fury. Deep underground, massive crystal formations were aligning, preparing to channel power that could reach into space itself. But then Taemin looked at the humans who had stayed behind. Hanul stood beside Jindal, her small hand resting protectively on the young dragon's claw. She had chosen to remain even knowing about the orbital bombardment. Minho was with Senara, their neural connection allowing them to share fear and comfort equally. Dozens of other human workers had refused evacuation orders, standing with the dragons they had come to see as friends rather than tools. These humans hadn't enslaved the dragons. Most of them hadn't even known about the conditioning process. They were miners, engineers, maintenance workers, people just trying to make a living in a dangerous galaxy, people who had shown kindness to beings they barely understood. "Kailva," Taemin said quietly, "I know you have the power to destroy the fleet. I know you could take revenge for everything that was done to you. But look around you." The ancient dragon's eyes followed Taemin's gesture to the humans scattered throughout the group. People who had chosen to stay. People who were willing to die rather than abandon their dragon friends. "These people aren't your enemies," Taemin continued. "They're victims too. The consortium treats human workers almost as badly as they treated you. We're all just tools to them. Expendable resources." Hanoil stepped forward, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "I've worked in mines since I was 16 years old. I've seen the consortium destroy human colonies, strip entire worlds bare, treat people like machinery. They're the enemy, not us." Minho nodded agreement. "My family died in a mining accident because the consortium wouldn't pay for proper safety equipment. I came here because I needed work, but I stayed because I found friends." He looked at Senara, whose scales shimmered with protective colors. "Real friends?" The crystal formations pulsed with energy, waiting for Kailva's decision. 25 minutes until bombardment. The ancient dragon had the power to save its people through violence, but it would mean destroying the humans who had shown them kindness. Kailva closed its eyes and sang. The song was unlike anything the other dragons had ever heard. It contained memories of the homeworld, but not just the beautiful ones. It held the pain of loss, the centuries of slavery, the fear of death, but woven through the darker themes was something else. Hope, love, the possibility of a future where different species could stand together instead of destroying each other. When the song ended, Kailva opened its eyes and looked directly at Taemin. "You gave me back my heart," the dragon said. "My heart tells me that revenge is easy, but building something better is hard. I choose the hard path." The ancient dragon raised its voice, speaking to the crystal networks that connected every formation on the planet. But instead of weaponizing them, Kailva sang a different kind of command. The crystals throughout the colony began to transform. The change started small. Individual crystal formations sprouted new growth, creating structures that were part mineral, part technology, part art. The dragon work areas reshaped themselves into spaces designed for comfort rather than efficiency. The harsh industrial lighting was replaced by crystal formations that glowed with soft, natural radiance. But the transformation didn't stop there. The crystals spread outward from the colony, growing through the planet's crust, creating a network of structures that were alive in ways human science couldn't explain. Healing centers where the dragons could recover from centuries of trauma. Communication arrays that would let them contact others of their kind across the galaxy. Defenses that were protective rather than aggressive. Most importantly, the crystals created something that had never existed before on Kepler 442b. Partnership facilities. Spaces designed for humans and dragons to work together as equals. Translation. Matrices that would allow direct communication without neural contact. Research labs where both species could explore the possibilities of crystalline technology. The consortium fleet above watched in confusion as the planet's surface transformed. Beneath them, their sensors detected massive energy signatures but no weapons, no aggressive actions, just change, growth, evolution. Fleet Admiral Kyung Woo's voice crackled through the communication system, tight with uncertainty. Colony base. What is happening? Down there. Our sensors are detecting massive crystalline formations but no hostile signatures. Director Sora stared at her screens in disbelief. The readings showed power levels that should have been impossible, but the energy wasn't being directed at the fleet. It was being used to build something. Admiral, she said slowly. I think they're creating something new. Taman stood beside Kaelva, watching as the dragon's vision became reality around them. The mining colony was gone, replaced by a city that looked like it had grown from the planet itself. Human and dragon spaces intertwined in harmony, connected by crystal pathways that hummed with shared consciousness. What have you done? He asked in wonder. I have created a choice, Kaelva replied. The fleet above can still destroy us, but now they must choose between destruction and the chance to see what we can build together. Hanul approached them, her eyes wide as she took in the transformed world around them. The consortium will never accept this. They'll see it as a threat to their control. Then they will have to decide, Kaelva said, whether they value control more than possibility. High above, Fleet Admiral Kyung-woo faced the same choice. His orders were clear. Destroy the rebellion, maintain consortium authority. But his sensors showed him something unprecedented. A civilization being born. Two species choosing cooperation over conquest. The bombardment countdown reached 0. The Admiral's finger hovered over the firing control, and in that moment, the crystal formations throughout the planet began to sing. Not with anger or threat, but with an invitation. The music reached into space itself, touching the minds of every human in the fleet. For just a moment, they felt what Taemin had felt when he first touched Kaelva's hand. They experienced the possibility of connection across species, the chance to be part of something larger than profit and control. The Admiral's hand moved away from the firing control. Stand down, weapons, he ordered quietly. We're going to see what they've built down there. On the planet's surface, dragons and humans worked together to build the first interspecies colony in galactic history. It wouldn't be easy. There would be conflicts, misunderstandings, and challenges that neither species had faced before, but they would face them together. Taemin looked at his hand, still tingling from the neural connection that had started everything. Such a simple gesture, touch, contact. The willingness to reach across the void between minds and say, I know that pain.